Hi everyone. In this session today, we'll cover what is Azure Arc, and we'll look at exploring how Azure can bring capabilities to your on-premise and multi-cloud services. Just a really quick introduction to myself. So my name is Robert Thomas. I head up the modern work here at Valto. I've got a QR code there to my LinkedIn page. If you scan that, you can get access to Valto and some of the content that we're pushing out. There's various webinars, articles, and YouTube videos. Just an overview of the agenda. So we'll look at understanding Azure Arc. We'll go through Azure Arc Features. We'll focus on Azure Arc enabled servers. We'll go through a quick demo, and then I'll explain some sort of use cases and successes where we've used the technology, and then potentially a Q&A session at the end. The first thing we'll do is actually understand what Azure Arc is. So what is Azure Arc? So Azure Arc is a service from Microsoft that extends Azure management and services to any infrastructure, whether it's on premises or edge, or it could be in another cloud environment as well. Some of the features of the service would include things like unified management. So Azure Arc provides a centralized platform to manage your entire environment, including non-Azure and on-premise resources like servers, basically through the Azure Resource Manager. So this allows you to manage things like virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, and even databases as if they're running in Azure, but they're actually hosted in on-premise infrastructure. It also includes sort of hybrid and multi-cloud support. So it enables you to manage Windows and Linux physical servers and virtual machines hosted again outside of the Azure platform on your corporate network, or maybe other cloud providers like AWS. And the whole point is to kind of have an easy implementation and a consistent inventory and management and governance and security across your entire environment. As I mentioned, it includes support for Kubernetes and data services. So Azure Arc allows you to attach and configure Kubernetes clusters running pretty much anywhere and manage them at scale. So it also supports running Azure data services on premises, at the edge, or in public clouds. It's also got DevOps integration, so you can use things like GitOps to deploy configurations across one or more clusters from like Git repositories. So you basically get zero touch compliance and configuration for things like AKS with Azure policy. And also we've got the security compliance, so Azure Arc helps protect non-Azure servers with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Allows you to use Azure automation for frequent and time-consuming management tasks. So just looking at why we would use Azure Arc. So I guess the main thing is the management capabilities and what it's designed to do. So if you think of Azure, it's a RESTful service. So you've got multiple management interfaces in it with interacting with Azure. So I can interact with services via the Azure portal, so a web-based UI, or I could use Azure CLI, I could use Azure PowerShell, or maybe some sort of RESTful client. Having that kind of features allows us to interact with on-premise objects as if they were sort of within the Azure management plane. So you can kind of access those services pretty much anywhere using any preferred method. Other things included like the enhanced security and compliance. So we could use Azure Arc. It integrates with the Azure Security Center. So you get all of that advanced threat protection and security management for your on-premise resources as if they were Azure resources. And then you can do clever things like compliance. So you can enforce compliance policies across your entire environment, ensuring that all of the resources adhere to regulatory requirements. So it's a bit like with Intune policies, managing your endpoints in a cloud environment. It's a similar story, but for your, let's say, your on-premise servers. Next is the scalability. So Azure Arc enables you to scale your on-premise infrastructure by leveraging Azure's cloud capabilities. So you can easily extend your infrastructure without significant capital investment. Then you've got the flexibility. So it supports a wide range of environments, including Windows, Linux, Kubernetes distributions. And it can manage diverse infrastructure. And then you've got kind of Azure's backbone. So there's 50 plus Azure regions, multi-cloud, multiple data centers across the entire globe. So it's got the Microsoft network is one of the biggest and most resilient networks on the planet. So using that component to manage your on-premise resources, it's going to be at a significant advantage than say using a smaller company's tool like an RMM agent or something like that. You're plugging it into one of the biggest public clouds on the planet. As I mentioned, the DevOps automation, so using those to support like the Git repos and everything kind of is saved infrastructure as code. So rather than having what we call ClickOps, where it's all done through the GUI, you can create repositories of code of your well-structured environments and kind of follow the DevOps methodology. Maybe another advantage is sort of the business continuity, so integrating disaster recovery. So Azure Arc, you can enhance the Arc recovery strategy by integrating those on-premise resources with the Azure tools like the backup and recovery solutions. And then we've got things like high availability, where we can ensure those critical applications leverage Azure's infrastructure and services across those many data centers we just spoke about. Okay, so looking at some of the features of Azure Arc. So it's important to understand that Azure Arc is primarily like an existing set of features available in the Azure estate, but then you extend those to non-cloud resources. So again, on-premise servers, virtual machines, physical servers, Kubernetes, and so forth. So the first one there is you've got Azure Arc enabled servers. I've starred that because that's what we'll be focusing on in this video. But just to mention a few of the other pieces, we've got Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So that provides advanced threat protection and security recommendations across your hybrid and multi-cloud workloads. So that's your Arc connected servers to basically strengthen your security posture across the entire estate. Then we've got Microsoft Sentinel, which we'll touch on a bit more. It's the cloud native SIEM that ingests and analyzes data from your Arc connected resources. So you get security analytics and incident detection and automated response. Then we've got Azure Policy, so this enables consistent governance across your Arc managed environments by enforcing rules and ensuring compliance across on-premises, multi-cloud and edge workloads. You can think of Azure Policy for those who work with like Intune compliance across their endpoints. It's a similar type of mechanism to ensure that they're adhering to those kind of rules that you put in place. Then you've got Azure Monitor, so this collects and analyzes the performance metrics and logs from your Arc-enabled servers, for example, just giving you a bit more visibility into the health and performance of the infrastructure. And then Azure Resource Manager, so this enables you to deploy, manage, and organize those connected resources through, like I said, infrastructure as code, using the Azure portal or some sort of RESTful service or PowerShell, just like there were native Azure resources, really, just using templates and automation. And then Microsoft Purview, so extending data governance and compliance across your hybrid environment, so you can like classify and track sensitive data across your Arc-enabled systems. So think about your databases and the data within those. Then there's Azure Auto Manage, so just simplifying IT operations by automatically applying best practice configurations for security, monitoring, and backup and updates to those Arc-enabled machines. So again, going back to how Intune works, think of that as like your configuration profiles. Then you've got the Azure Update Management Center, so centralizing update deployment and patch compliance reporting for your Arc-enabled servers, so helping you maintain consistent updates and your update hygiene across the estate. Then we've got Azure Arc enabled VMware vSphere. So this is something that's fairly new. So it integrates your on-premise VMware vSphere environments with Azure, allowing VM sort of inventory governance and again policy enforcement, just using the native Azure tools. Okay, so let's going to have a look a bit more at the Azure Arc enabled servers, on the benefits of those and how we help customers with that technology in specific. So just an overview of what Arc-enabled servers are. So this allows you to manage basically Windows and Linux physical and virtual machines hosted outside of Azure, like on your corporate network or other cloud providers, or maybe in a colo. And just think of it as using the Azure tools and portal to manage those resources. So we can kind of use things like a machine configuration, so we can audit settings inside the machine. So operating system settings, application configuration or presence, environment settings, configuration of code. As I mentioned before, we can protect and secure our servers, or non-Azure servers, I should say, with Microsoft Defender for Cloud, specifically Defender for Server. So that's your threat detection your vulnerability management and proactively monitoring, for potential security threats. So that Defender for Cloud will present alerts and remediation suggestions from any of those threats that are detected. And then we can plug Microsoft Sentinel in those as well to collect security-related events and correlate them with other data sources. Then the configuration, so again, using Azure automation for like frequent and time-consuming management tasks, using like PowerShell and Python runbooks. For those of you that are familiar with runbooks, we can use what we call hybrid workers. So we can build and set tasks in the cloud, and they'll execute on premises. So that could be scripts for creating like AD users, those kind of things. We can assess configuration changes for installed software, Microsoft services or Windows registry files and things. Or if it's in the Linux world, we can check for Linux daemons and those kind of things and change tracking. Then we've got the Azure sort of Update Manager. So this is a tool that basically replaces WSUS. So we can manage operating system updates for Windows and Linux servers, and we can automate the onboarding and configuration of those services and create like what we call update schedules. So completely replacing legacy WSUS or maybe third-party update RMM agents, for example, and just using native Microsoft tools to kind of unify the management and save cost. And then we've got things like monitoring as well. So monitoring the operating system performance, discover application components to monitor processes and any dependencies with those. So it's using like the VM insights, which I'll cover in a demo, and also collecting other log data, such as just performance metrics or operating system events, using Azure Monitor Agent, basically. So in terms of Azure Arc enabled servers and the connectivity and how it actually works. There's a number of ways in which our on-premise servers will talk to Azure. So the first kind of default one is direct internet connection. So the Azure connected machine agent communicates directly with Azure over HTTPS. There's no VPN or express route needed. It's outbound only, so there's no inbound ports. You have to set up on your firewalls or edge devices, and it's quite ideal for sort of simple setups or small environments. Next, we've got proxy server connections. So if your environment requires internet traffic to pass through a proxy server, the Azure Arc agent can be configured to use this. So it supports unauthenticated proxies and authenticated with basic authentication. Then we can use things like private link, so Azure Arc private connectivity. So instead of sending traffic over the public internet, Azure Arc can be configured to use Azure Private Link. So we create private endpoints in Azure, and we connect those to on-premise networks, either via VPN or express route if there's going to be a lot of traffic or you need greater security or SLAs. This is much more secure, obviously, so traffic stays on private networks rather than being routed through the public internet. As I said before, it requires a VPN gateway or express route connection between your network and Azure. And you've got things like DNS configuration to resolve Azure Arc service endpoints and private IPs and that kind of thing. And now the private link is now currently available and in GA for Azure Arc enabled servers as well for most regions. So definitely worth exploring that connectivity method. Then just going in a bit more detail so you can see once the connectivity is established, as I mentioned before, you can see on the screen here that we've got the various ways that we can interact with our Arc-enabled servers through the VM extensions. So we've got the Azure portal, we've got the Azure REST API, which can kind of interact with everything on the Azure Resource Manager. You've got Azure CLI, so we can either use CLI agents installed on your local sysadmin or development machine, or you could use PowerShell script, whichever you're more familiar with. You've got Windows Admin Center, which is a more modern web-based solution for managing your server estate. I'll cover that in a bit more detail. And then we've also got the Azure Auto Manager as well, which we discussed. And again, look to the right side of the screen. Those VMs may be either on-premise, hosted on VMware, or they could be in any of the other public clouds. But obviously, when you get to the Azure control plane, they're just represented as Azure Arc-enabled servers. And then with those VM extensions, you could just leverage all of the great tools in Azure, as we've mentioned before, things like Monitor, Key Vaults, and Log Analytics, or custom scripts. Just to discuss the licensing model a bit more. So in terms of what you actually pay for to make sure a server is Azure Arc enabled, there's actually no cost with that. So just installing the Azure Arc agent on the machine, enabling the control plane functionality, there's no cost, and you'll get basic things like tagging, management groups, activity logs, access to templates, and the resource graph, and the basic role-based access control. There's no cost to do that, so I'd recommend just enabling this as a default, just so you can sort of experiment and see how it works. Then where you start to pay for services in Azure is when you start to enable some of the Azure features. So if you enable things like Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, Defender for Cloud, if you set up Sentinel, that's where you're actually paying for the elements of the subscription. And to be honest, those are quite cheap services. So if you're applying these to your server workloads, these often are replacing third-party solutions like RMM agents, so like Ninja and Enable, and then things like the monitoring. Again, a lot of customers have moved over to this from things like Logic Monitor, and again, backups, people paying for third-party solutions like Veeam. This all kind of consolidates that costing and just adds it into the Azure subscription. And in most cases, does save money. Well, also you may pay for additional Arc-enabled services if you ingest things, if you connect things other than servers into Arc. So you've got the Azure machine learning app services, so the platform as a service pieces. They do have some costs associated with them, but for the Arc-enabled servers, it's definitely worth kind of setting this up and replacing those third-party tools. Again, so just a kind of an overview of those specific pricing. So the premium capabilities that kind of start to rack up the bills in the subscription, and the automation configuration management. I know this is in dollars, but it was $6 per server per month. Things like the Azure Policy guest configuration, again, the $6 per server per month. Microsoft Defender, so you get billed for the volume of data ingested for analysis and Defender. So if you're ingesting all of the event logs of your financial services, for example, you'll want to collect all of those data endpoints. It's around $2 per gigabyte ingested. And again, you get quite decent bulk discounts if you've got a large server estate. Same for the Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, you pay per gigabyte. And then the Defender for Cloud is $5 per server per month for the plan 1, and then $15 for the plan 2. So in terms of the cost, it's kind of pretty much on the level playing field of all of the other EDR and server endpoint solutions. I guess the main advantage is the integration into all of the other good Microsoft services. And you'll see as well, for the first 30 days, you get 500 megabytes of server data included for free. So that would include all the events being ingested into Azure Monitor and those kind of things. Okay, so let's just talk about some of the actual benefits of Arc-enabled servers, why you would go ahead and would deploy this technology for managing your on-premise and hybrid servers. So as I mentioned before, Azure Monitor. So this is just a native monitoring product built into the Azure control plane. So there's no need for, again, any third-party RMM products or third-party dashboards. Everything just hooks into native Azure. It's really easy to configure once you've onboarded into Arc. It's just like a one-click deployment. And you get things like VM insights to analyze the performance of your Azure Arc-enabled servers. You can create like dashboards, so they're called Azure Workbooks, which are a bit like a Power BI dashboard. And you can connect things like Power BI or other third-party measuring tools into the log analytics and run queries. Then we've got Microsoft Sentinel. So this is a probably like the #1 cloud-native SIEM, security, information and events management platform. So this is basically probably one of the most common SOC tools used on the market. which basically collects all of your data at scale across the users, devices, applications, and infrastructure, and then can basically detect and produce incidents and alerts based on threats that are found. You can investigate those threats with AI and hunt for suspicious activities at scale. And then you can almost use it as a SOC tool to respond rapidly to security incidents, and also use automation in that process as well. And again, Sentinel plugs directly into Defender for Server. And then if it's an on-premise environment, you've probably got an AD environment as well. So using Defender for Identity to collect on-premise signals and feed that into your SOC solution. Then just a bit more information on Defender for Server. So again, this is the antivirus, the anti-malware, or the EDR endpoint that sits on each server. So you would replace things like Sophos with this tool. And again, it's a one-click deployment with Azure extensions. There's no reinstalling of agents. And you get things like vulnerability assessments, just-in-time VM access, obviously all of the usual anti-malware that you'd expect today. And it can be kind of guardrailed with Azure policy. Then we also got Defender for Cloud for SQL servers. So continuously assess, secure your SQL estate, harden your hybrid and multi-cloud SQL servers. This also allows you to deploy Defender at scale to your Arc-enabled SQL Server estate. And you'll get things like recommendations, security alerts, workload protection, and secure score. Okay, cool. Let's now go into a demo just to have a look at this technology in real time and have a bit more of an overview of how it works and what it looks like. So I've got the Azure portal page open here, and I've got the Azure Arc product. So I'm going to start at the overview section. The first place I can go to is a snapshot, so we can just see what have we actually got onboarded into Azure Arc. So we've got 5 machines here, so 5 servers, and we've also got a SQL server. I'll just go back here. So there's a few things that we can do from the home page. It's really easy to add more resources to Azure Arc or onboard things like servers. So I just go to add resources here. There's various things I can do. So I can add Kubernetes clusters. I can also connect hosted environments as well. So VMware vSphere, as I mentioned before, the System Center integration. And this is something that we'll probably have to touch in a separate webinar or video series, but you've got something called Azure Local, which is based on HCI. So this is about procuring Microsoft certified hardware and then deploying any Azure resources on your own hardware. So you won't be paying for the compute resource of Microsoft. Just going back to the things like machines, so basically onboarding virtual or physical servers, that's really easy. So we can go to add a machine. And again, there's multiple ways of doing that. So we can add a single server with a script. We can generate an installer to push out to multiple servers, or we can add servers from things like AWS, or we can push it through an update management channel. So again, there's loads of different ways to get your servers into Azure Arc. And they've made it as straightforward as possible, to be fair. Okay, just going back down to the home page here, we'll just kind of go through some of the services of Azure Arc. So pretty much everything you need to get to is also here. So we've got the machine, so we can review all of the servers connected to it. We've got our own hosted environments that we can connect. So Azure Local, as I described, hosting Azure resource on your own physical hardware rather than like the UK South or UK West data center or US East. And then we've got things like the VMware and vCenters. Next, we've got data services. So here we can actually connect to and manage SQL servers. Again, SQL servers on premise or in a colo, for example. We can manage those through the Azure control plane and benefit from all the features. There's things like IoT, application services, what I mentioned before. Then we can also manage our licenses, so we can benefit from hybrid licensing with Windows. Same with the SQL Server licenses as well. Then we've got the DevOps pieces where we can deploy things via templates. Okay, so the first place I'll start is I'll go to SQL Server instances. So we've onboarded one SQL Server into Azure Arc. So if I go here, I can review the server with SQL's installed on it. So it should be SQL 22. I can actually see that represented as an object in Azure, even though it's a virtual server hosted on premise. Again, I get the overview. It's exactly the same control plane as Azure. I get all of the usual information and the properties of that server. And I can see the backup status and things there as well. When I'm in this control plane, the overview, this kind of pane now changes. So there's various things that I can do. So I've got the best practice assessments. So this is a built-in tool that evaluates your Arc-enabled SQL Server instances against like Microsoft's recommended best practices. It provides like actionable insights across performance, security, and configurations to help you optimize and maintain your SQL environment, basically. So if I go into an assessment here, I get a full overview of the last time this was assessed. And I get kind of a list of recommendations and a summary of those and the severity. And I can see if they're sort of at the server level or at the database level. And then I can kind of create a plan to basically remediate these actions and improve the security posture or the best practice setup of the server, if you like. Let's just go back a level. Then I've got what you call updates. So in this particular example, because of the license configuration, because it's only demo, I can't access the updates features here, but I'll show you that on another server. Then we've got, again, Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So again, this is just your Microsoft Defender for server, but this one also applies to SQL boxes. We get the full antivirus and malware protection, all of the recommendations and the secure score to improve this. You can even simulate some of the alerts and kind of send it to global threat intelligence. Then the next piece is the data management piece. So this is kind of the database inventory and status of the databases installed onto the server. So if I go into here, I can actually view all of the DB associated with the server. If I just go into a demo one for now, for example, again, I can kind of view the status up there as well and the backups. Can go and see that kind of the automated backups that have been set up at the SQL level as well, not just on the actual server of the VM. And then if I scroll down here, we've also got like a migration assessment. So any on-premise servers you onboard into Azure Arc, we can also do a database migration assessment. So we can even see if this server could potentially be migrated to Azure to see if we could if it's eligible for migration. So maybe this one perhaps hasn't got the assessment. It might be another virtual machine that we can go and look at. Let's just go back to Azure Arc. So next we just go to the machines. So these are all of the servers that I've just wait for the internet to load again. Perfect. So these are all of the on-premise virtual servers that we've onboarded into Arc. So you can see we've got various different operating systems on here. We've got Windows Server 2025, 22. We've also got some Linux on Ubuntu. If I just start with the Azure Arc SQL, stop that one. So again, similar to how when you view VMs inside Azure, you get a similar control plane. You can kind of view all of the essential information. If I scroll down, we've also got some capabilities and recommendations. One of the good things about kind of using Azure Arc is you kind of obviously using the Azure control plane, but you also get access to all of the features. So we can now start to use things like Copilot in Azure Arc. So we can ask questions in Copilot. So I can say, what management services can I enable on my Arc-enabled machines? Copilot for Azure will go off and find that relevant information, bring back that response as well. So it's recommending that we use things like the change tracking and inventory. It's then also saying Microsoft Defender for Cloud, what we talked about. And it also gives some recommended prompts on how we can guide me through setting that up, for example. So we can use Copilot inside Azure Arc for on-premise servers. Going down to here, so we've got things like the update, so it knows but there's 5 updates pending. So this is replacing WSUS. So again, using the Azure control plane. Just getting some network errors at the moment. Let's go back a level. There we go. Let's go back onto there. There we go. So as well as updates, we've got things like hot patch. So we can basically receive like monthly security updates without having to do any reboots. So we're starting to move customers onto Windows Server 25 because that supports hot patch. Even servers hosted on premise, we're now using Azure Arc to update those servers without having to reboot them. So we've got quite a few customers in the manufacturing industry, for example. For those ones that are in like the SME market, they might not have huge application clusters. They may be relying on servers, maybe server replicas, but we can use the hot patch now to patch those servers without having to kind of shut those servers down. So some of those manufacturing organizations have a really strict kind of shutdown policy inside the organization. So they kind of have 24/7 manufacturing. So finding those windows to install those critical security updates is really hard. But since onboarding them onto this, they've managed to kind of remain compliant. Then we've got the monitoring and insight. So we talked about Azure Monitor. So I can go into here. Just do this one side here, go into Monitor and Insights, click on Azure Monitor. There we go. That's better. There we go. So again, similar kind of benefits of like a standard RMM tool. You kind of get the live performance of the server on premise, so the CPU utilization, things like available memory, disk IOPS, and those kind of things. So again, we can use Azure Monitor to kind of track that in real time. Let's go back to the Azure machines. Here we go. Internet's definitely playing up today. Cool. So next we've got things like policy. So we can see the policies that are assigned to the servers as well. So if I click on here, just refresh this. Let's go to a different server. There we go. So we can apply policies to servers, just like configuration profiles on Intune devices. So we can create an Azure security baseline. Then we can actually track that to see if that server is adhering to our policy requirements. So again, if I can kind of go into here, I've got some sample policies that kind of basically require the server to have certain things connected, mandatory like log analytics workspaces, enabling things like SQL assessments to make sure the server's up to best practice. We can enforce those policies onto servers, and also configuration as well. So certain settings within the operating system. Okay. Next, we'll have a look at the Windows Admin Center. So if I go onto here, there we go, just connect that. So that's loading. So Windows Admin Center is a modern sort of web-based management tool designed to replace those traditional older RSAT tools. So one of the benefits of this is got better security, so there's less sort of interactive logins. You get the full Azure integration, and there's even offline availability for servers that are hosted in really secure environments. And again, it's sort of a typical server manager where you've got live access to the monitoring, alerts. You've got all of these different tools that you'd have spread across different RSAT tools in sort of one nice and easy to use control plane. So we can even kind of run PowerShell locally on that server and actually execute those commands as if you were logged onto the server locally. Just try and connect here for a second. There we go. So we can execute those commands in the browser for a server that's hosted on premise, even though this Azure Arc deployment is kind of running probably from, I think, UK South. We've also got things like the roles and features. So we can upgrade and install different features on our servers, turn them into domain controllers, for example. And we've got the ability to change those. Then we've got these things like scheduled tasks, obviously the update managers. And we can kind of review any processes as well that are on the server. We can start and end those processes, and also kind of things like packet monitoring, file sharing. So all of the usual, most common settings that we'd manage across our server estate, we can now do this for all of the servers onboarded into Azure Arc. Okay, let's just go back and see if the internet's behaving, and we can go and have a look at that SQL assessment, because that's quite a good feature. Let's have a look. Let's go to Azure Arc, SQL instances. See if we can get the assessment. There we go. It's working again now. So in this example, we connected an on-premise SQL server, and then we've run an assessment to see if that database can be moved to any one of the different SQL products that Azure offers. So Azure offers the SQL managed instance, which is a bit sort of platform as a service. Then, of course, you've got SQL Server on an Azure VM, so it's almost like the like, but hosted on Azure, so infrastructure as a service, if you like. Then we've also got Azure, the SQL database, almost the software as a service, Azure SQL product. And you can see it's kind of got, if it's ready to be deployed into any one of these products. So for the managed instance, it's not ready. The SQL Server on a VM, it is ready. It's even suggested the size of the VM that we should host this on. And it's got a confidence rating there and suggested tools that we could do this. So if I click on here, it gives us what the blocker issue is for kind of moving the database to a managed instance. So we can see there's kind of, there's the file stream feature. So we've got unstructured data, things like text and documents that require an NTFS file system. That's not supported in a managed instance, and that's probably going to be the same for the Azure SQL as well. So again, we've got for items that require an NTFS file system, usually unstructured data. But it also provides recommendations on how we can sort of change that. So maybe moving these to like Azure Blob Storage or something different to kind of make those changes to see if we could, if we really wanted to do that. So in this instance, it's actually two. Got like impacted columns as well, which is quite important to know. If I choose the SQL on server, it's kind of, this is fine. So there's no blockers, there's no warnings, and there's some suggested configuration details on how best to set this up if we do go down this route. So again, we've used this before when we're kind of conducting assessments of customers on premise. Integrating this has been really handy to see what servers we can move and where is the best place to move them to, or what technology is best to utilize. You can see it's kind of the recommended SQL configuration if we were to move that into Azure. Let's just see if a few more of these bits are now working now the internet is behaving. So let's go back to this one. So we've gone through the admin center, the security piece. So again, that's just for the Defender for server. Then you've got the Azure Site Recovery, so kind of replicating those servers into Azure, and the Azure Backup policies. Hot patch we've discussed as well. And then the monitoring and insights we've also discussed. Let's just go check in the updates. There we go. So we found all of the updates that are available for this server in particular. We can go to the Azure Update Manager, and we can sort of see all of the Azure Arc machines that do require some sort of update. So we can even see the Linux updates that are also pending as well. Just go back to machines. There we go. Policies is working now as well. So just to kind of touch back onto the policies and the configuration management, we can see all of the policies that are in a non-compliant state or the ones that are enabled. So things like enforcing tagging. We've also got our baseline deployments. So we can kind of find, we can make sure they adhere to kind of our baseline setup, if you like. I go to machine configuration. Let's just choose what our baseline is. So we can see the compliance state for basically settings at the operating system level. I'll just select compliance so we can see for things like adjusting memory quotas, allowing user control over installs, so turning things off, making sure it audits on just generic kind of Windows Server hardening policies that you'd recommend. You can apply these to a server. I'll just go back. You can create your own custom configurations. So you can create a configuration package, then you basically store that in a storage account, and then you basically set the type. So do you want the configuration just to audit against the settings on the server? Or do you want to kind of audit and monitor to see if they change? Or you can do what we call audit and apply and auto correct. So this will actually fix and change those settings on the server. So we can create kind of ARM templates to set up our policies. So this is an example Azure Windows baseline. You can do just things like minimum password length, what the expected value should be, where to remediate it, things like password age. And we can package that up into a custom configuration and then host it in a storage account and provide the URI. Then we can choose what it's going to do. So again, similar kind of experience to Intune in that you're creating configuration profiles, hosting them in the cloud, and then applying them to physical devices. Okay, just a quick overview on use cases and success stories. So where we use this quite effectively is the on-premises and managed services. So we support customers with infrastructure based on VMware or Hyper-V, for example. So for this, for a lot of them, we're using Azure Arc enabled service with Azure Arc enabled VMware and vSphere. So this really simplifies the management of the entire estate by extending, again, the Azure control plane to the VMware vSphere infrastructure. Just enables the use of Azure security, governance, and management capabilities consistently across VMware and vSphere. So we can consolidate all typical MSP operations into one solution. So the backup and DR is managed in Azure. The server endpoint detection and security is managed in Defender for Cloud. Updates are managed from Azure. Sentinel sits on top, formulating our zero trust approach with the security operations. Additional features for Arc-enabled vSphere include lifecycle management for VMs. So your typical create, read, update, and delete operations for server resources. And again, we just get that unified approach. We don't have to rely on lots of different third-party services. We can kind of have a Microsoft-centric approach that the customer's got confidence in and is happy to have deployed in their environment. And we kind of, the main thing is saving cost on those managed services, but improving the operational efficiency. Next kind of sort of success, really where we've used this technology is, again, migration and unified operations. So migrating, say, a subset of workloads with, the unified operation strategy on top of it. because I've managed to get working in that demo before, was the server assessment. So in this particular example, this was a manufacturing-based client, quite a large one, with at least sort of 50 servers on premise. We were able to sort of provide an assessment of those servers and move around 28 VMs to Azure with the enablement of Sentinel. Being manufacturing, they had to keep some like sort of SCADA manufacturing systems on premise, local, inside the production facilities. So they were left with a much smaller premise footprint, but also servers in Azure. And that's when Azure Arc was able to kind of sit on top of those two environments and just provide that unified operations approach, again with managed services and all of the tools that we've just discussed. And then the customer then is left with a single management plane to manage the workloads both in Azure and on premise. And that also enabled us to decommission their SCCM as endpoint devices have sort of been migrated to Intune shortly after the pandemic. We were then able to kind of get rid of SCCM and replace it fully with Arc. So they kind of had their cloud first approach, which is what they were kind of struggling to achieve, but using this technology and moving some instances to the cloud really it allowed them to kind of fulfill that journey to where they were happy with. So that was definitely a big success. So in terms of what we can do with Azure Arc, or what we are doing for customers, so I could mention we've got managed services for hybrid and on-premise infrastructure. Again, some of it is Azure Arc centric, so you can definitely look into enabling those features for you. And then we've got complete Arc enabled server deployments. So all of the technologies that I've previously discussed, we've got pre-built Azure Arc deployments that are designed to deliver that exceptional, governance, compliance, and security. And our sort of Valto built solutions ensure that all connected resources are consistently managed, monitored, and protected across hybrid and multi-cloud. So they also align with the strict requirements of sort of network and informational security directives. And we've helped customers meet their, critical regulatory obligations while maintaining, that agility and operational excellence for their servers. If this is something that you feel like we can help with, then please do reach out to hello@valto.co.uk. We can put you in touch with one of our solution architects to understand where we can help and how we can apply this to your environment. Cool, and I think that is everything for now. If there are any questions, just feel free to post into the Q&A. I'll stick around for a couple of minutes just to make sure that we can answer some of these. But someone has actually asked, does Arc enabled server actually replace SCCM then? I would say not necessarily. So Arc adds, the cloud-based capabilities like your Azure Policy and Monitor and Defender for servers, but it can work alongside those tools like SCCM. I would always suggest you gradually shift more of that governance and security into Azure, so it's not disrupting your current management process, and then we can simply migrate completely away from SCCM and adopt Azure completely. Well, that makes sense. There's another question here. Can we manage Arc enabled servers across different Azure subscriptions and tenants? I'd say yeah, but obviously to manage anything across different subscriptions, it's quite straightforward. You just need to assign the appropriate RBAC roles onto those subscriptions. For different tenants, though, you would need a solution called Azure Lighthouse, which is what most service providers, including Valto, use to manage multiple Arc connected resources across different tenancies at scale. So we use Lighthouse for Azure Arc, for monitoring multiple Sentinel workspaces for our SOC service that we do. So yeah, it is possible to do that. You just need to set it up with like a service provider approach, or maybe an enterprise one as well. And then what's minimum requirements to onboard into Azure Arc? I'm assuming they mean minimum requirements to onboard a server into Azure Arc. But the earliest one we can do is Windows 2012 R2. I think you get extended support if you onboard those servers, but you can do a lot of Linux distributions. So like Ubuntu, Red Hat Enterprise, or CentOS. And then you just need outbound internet access, or obviously your proxies, and then just install that Azure Machine Agent, and you're done. This is quite a long question. So we are designing a hybrid and multi-cloud governance solution for a global enterprise using Azure Arc. The enterprise runs workloads across on-premise, VMware clusters, AWS EC2 instances, and Azure Kubernetes services. They require centralized policy management and compliance auditing, inventory visibility, GitOps. Sensitive workloads hosted on-premise must remain compliant with specific data sovereigns regulations in the EU and APAC regions. Can we use Arc for this? That's quite a big question, but the answer is yeah. Arc doesn't necessarily control where your data is. So that centralized policy management, governance and compliance, you can sort of set that to any of the regions that you see fit. But your VMware clusters, EC2 instances, and Kubernetes clusters, wherever you're hosting them will kind of determine kind of what regulations you need to adhere to. But Azure Arc can sit on top of that, and yeah, it won't affect any of those requirements, to be honest. It doesn't actually store data, which is why it doesn't really cost very much money at all. It's just enabling the tool set for it. I hope that answers that question. Okay, there's no more questions. I think we'll end it there. Like I said, if anybody has any requirements or wants to know more about the Arc-enabled servers or what Azure Arc can do, then do please reach out. Thanks very much.